keep in mind that most of these things that you're talking about with the Trump administration, it's horrible, and we're talking about it daily and weekly when everybody's getting together and trying to figure out how do you cope with this. And are my kids going to see some of these things that are really constitutional violations? They're different than anything. I mean, they really are.
Right, he's trying to remake the judiciary so that the judiciary rules in his favor.
The judiciary, the executive branch.
Congress doesn't meet anymore.
So basically, he's reshaping the government, I think. And so you can argue about whether it's useful to study Germany in the late 30s. You can say the pendulum swings back and forth. I worry that when this pendulum swings, the people who are younger now or are starting to pay attention now, if this is the new normal.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is attorney John McKay, who has practiced law in Anchorage for almost 50 years. He has represented Alaskan and national news organizations, photographers, artists, and others on libel, privacy, and copyright issues, access to government proceedings and records, subpoenas to journalists, secret settlements by public agencies, cameras in courts, and many other matters. He taught media law at University of Alaska Anchorage for more than 30 years. In 2007, John was the first recipient of the Alaska Press Club's First Amendment Award, and in 2011, on the 40th anniversary of the ACLU of Alaska, he was recognized as one of 40 heroes of constitutional rights and civil liberties. He is the author of a legal guidebook for Alaska news reporters and of publications on privacy law and open government law. John has two sons, both in their mid-30s, whose mother, Suzan Nightingale McKay, was a beloved columnist and opinions editor at the Anchorage Daily News. John McKay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Where were you born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, or made in Detroit. Actually, my dad was going to law school there. He was the first in his family to do such things. And on my birth certificate, it says that he was employed on the assembly line at the Studebaker factory in Detroit. She was doing in the other part of the day when he wasn't in school. And then he graduated from law school with two kids and no income and went to work with an insurance company for some years. And so we lived in Michigan. I was born and raised in Michigan and went to college there, but my family moved. I think by the time I came to Alaska, I think I'd lived 13 places, all in Michigan.
What did your mom do?
She ran the household. We had 8 kids. And that took up a lot of her time.
Were you the oldest?
I am the oldest. Yeah.
Of 8.
Yeah.
So what was that like?
It was good. I had a good family life, good growing up. We moved around a lot, but we settled in a small town in southwestern Michigan called Bangor as I was about 7th grade. And so I went to the same place for high school, had friends from that time on, some of whom have continue to be friends. I was growing up in a town that was basically the size of the dorm that I went to in my first year in college, about 2,000 people.
Were your parents Catholic?
Yes. Yeah. I think I gave it up for Lent about the end of high school or early college. I have that window into the world through that, even though that's not something that I...
Did it bother them that you left the church?
Oh, my dad died when I was in college, toward the end of my college, and I'm not sure what my mom knew or decided she knew about all of her children's choices as we went along. Is it a bigger sin to go to communion when you're home with your mom or to not?
Yeah.
and disappoint your mom? I don't know. So I don't know. I don't think of it as being something that there weren't tensions over that. There were tensions over Vietnam War and protests and that sort of thing at that time, mainly with my dad, but not.
Because your dad supported the Vietnam War and you didn't?
I wouldn't say he supported the Vietnam War. I truly wish that he had lived long enough that we could have talked about those things, because he was very thoughtful, but he also, I think to some extent, at that time I wasn't thinking about going to law school, but I think he probably had in the back of his mind, he didn't want me getting into trouble in ways that I wouldn't be able to, sort of pursue things that I wanted to do, and also what they were getting. And I guess I hadn't really thought about this for a minute, but it ties into what you're just asking about the religious background. In those days, the news media coming out of, say, the Catholic Church, for example, were pro-Nixon. I think there was a lot of concern that they were doing essentially what's happening now, is that they were painting people as anti-government, anti-American if you were involved in these protests. And so I think to some extent he was concerned about what he was hearing from those folks. I mean, he was thoughtful, and I think if we had a chance to talk it out more, I think the defining moment for or thing in my kids growing up is 9/11 for my age, the age of my kids. For me, it was civil rights movement and to some extent merging into the anti-war movement. And in those ways, what I grew up with was a dad who was a Republican, as his family was. I still believe my grandmother probably voted for that handsome young Catholic boy, John Kennedy, even though he was not a Republican. But that was a whole different thing in those days. And I remember hearing about him doing either sit-in or walk-out at lunch counter in Detroit when he was in law school there. And that was something there was never any question about. It was something that felt very strongly about. And so there's a lot of good influences that way, too.
You said he worked at an insurance company. What kind of law did he eventually practice?
In those days, State Farm hired lawyers to be claims adjusters.
Oh, gotcha.
So he was working as a claims adjuster, and he did that. And he met some friends doing that were also lawyers, and one of them went to work with his brother in southwestern Michigan and said, geez, we'd really love to have you come and do it with us. And he did at some point, and it was the end of our moving around, and it was a nice community, and he was a big part of it.
Did other kids become lawyers or just you?
In my immediate family, I'm the only one.
Were you interested in the law because of your dad or other reasons?
I didn't decide until late to go to law school, but I basically, if I had the guts, I would have probably skipped a year between college and law school because I didn't know what I wanted to do.
You graduated from Michigan State in 1972, and you got your JD in 1975.
Yeah.
So that's pretty straight through.
I guess I didn't decide to go to law school right away. And when I say I didn't decide, I think I was afraid that if I didn't go right straight through, that I probably wouldn't go. I'd go off and do something else.
What did you get your undergraduate degree in?
I think it was called multidisciplinary social science.
A little bit of everything.
The thing that when you first go in, you say you're no pref, and then you just put a label on it and call it essentially the same. So there's some political science and econ, sociology, and psychology, and that sort of thing. I got a master's in journalism.
After you got your JD?
I was really drawn to journalism at that time. And in the last millennium, I got a master's in journalism.
It's interesting because I've had a lot of journalists on the podcast in the past couple of months. And it makes sense that you had an interest in journalism because you've been a First Amendment lawyer representing journalists basically for 50 years.
Pretty close, yeah.
But I assume that you were really interested in journalism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I always have been. I was a stringer for a while and then worked at the Detroit Free Press, mainly over a summer between years of law school. And I worked for a public interest law firm that specialized in communication stuff for the other summer in law school. I think I'll be involved in the student newspaper in high school and a little bit in college. I think there's always this tension between journalism and law where if you are a journalist, which route do you want to go? People successfully combine those things at times. And I've gone the route of being a lawyer, but I think 47 years of representing journalists here. I think if you're a lawyer, sometimes it's really attractive to see what journalists do because they come along and they cherry pick. They come in and they hit the story, the important parts of it, what's going on, or come back to it as they go on. And then they go off and do other interesting things. And as a lawyer, you feel like you're left slogging through discovery and a lot more mundane things. But on the other hand, lawyers have subpoena power, which journalists are very envious of, or you can actually go into court and do something. And so both of them have their draws, and I've melded the two.
How did you end up in Alaska?
When I graduated from law school in 1975, I had a cousin, Pat, who was coming up to Alaska at that time. He was a couple years younger. I clerked for a federal judge in Michigan for 2 years. And also I was married. I married during the time I was in law school, and my wife died in between the 2 years of my clerkship.
That is crazy. So y'all only married for a couple of years.
Yeah.
How did she die?
She had leukemia, something that could be cured now, but wasn't then. So I didn't have kids. My cousin said he was moving to Alaska. I was out actually right after the clerkship. I was out with my sister who lived in Maine, still does. And we made a little house in the back of an old new Datsun pickup I bought, and we traveled around the maritime provinces. And I got a call from my cousin and said, I'm moving to Alaska. Can you help me drive my furniture up? And I said, when are you going? And he said, Saturday. And I said, I've got to be in a wedding in Michigan on Saturday, so I can't. He said, well, I'll wait until Monday. And so he did, and I did. And I threw my bike on the back of the furniture truck and went home and got my other stuff and came up.
I would just think that had to have been just a really difficult time to be, like, I guess in your early 20s and to lose your wife like so young.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course it was. And like I say, we hadn't had kids yet. I think if I had, I probably wouldn't have moved to Alaska. Highly unlikely.
Yeah. There was no reason for you to stay.
Actually, my family was there. There's plenty of reason to stay. I think about it with my kids now. That was before cell phones. And so when I wish my kids were in touch more, I think, oh, yeah, how much was I in touch with my mom during those times? There's the rest of my family.
So you got here with your cousin Pat in 1978?
No, 77. I think we came up over the highway in Labor Day weekend of 77.
Is he still here?
He just retired as a Superior Court judge not too long ago. And in fact, his son is now a district court judge in Palmer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you got here in September 77. You passed the Alaska bar in 78.
Right. Yeah, I was a baby lawyer and I got to do like the Hammond-Hickle election contest and things like that were interesting, meeting the governor. And actually I worked on his campaign for a little bit of doing media.
Hammond?
The 78 campaign, yeah. So at the same time, they had a little yellow house that's still there down at 6th and I. And so the Hammond headquarters was across the alley one way. And so I'd go over there and do a little work doing the media stuff, press releases, everything for them. And then I was working as a lawyer in that building. And I fell in with some people who turned out to be pretty significant in my life in those days, which was Howard Weaver was running a small newspaper called the Alaska Advocate. Howard was the editor. Pat Doherty, of course, later became editor of the Daily News. Somebody was asking lately about the business model for the Advocate. And I said the business model was everybody had a partner or spouse who was working,
right?
who brought in money because nobody there was getting paid. So I go down the alley that direction and read stories that were about to be published as a legal review. So across the alley, there's the Hammond headquarters. Out the window of the Hammond headquarters is the Daily News was located there at that time. So Howard, those folks didn't work there, but a woman named Suzan Nightingale did. She was a newspaper columnist. And I remember asking Carol Larson, who was also working for Hammond at the time, I said, who is that? And so I later found out. And I married her a couple of years later.
And she edited Hammond's autobiography.
She did, yeah. Suzan was a very popular columnist, and she was also the editorial page editor. And then after she took a break from that and then eventually got out of that when our first son, Martin, was born. But she edited Jay's book, The Bushwhack Governor. And I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think his second book is probably what she took out of his first book. That was edited around our dining room table. It was a classic Alaska story of just coming to the state, not knowing anybody. And in fact, I even called some friends of mine who were more active politically when I got here. And I said, okay, there's this guy and I can do some work on his campaign. He's running against Wally Hickle. And what do I know about Wally Hickle? What I know about Wally Hickle is that he's the governor of Alaska. Then he went to work for Nixon. He kind of stood up to Richard Nixon, especially over the Santa Barbara oil leases and things like that. And that's what I know about him. Anyway, but I did fall in with Hammond. So I got to know him during the election contest. It was like, how do you get to do that? First year starting to work, they finished editing, but they had to do one last round of it when everything came back. And so we went out to Lake Clark and I holed up in his little cabin while Suzan, and he worked on it and gave me his canoe to go down Lake Clark and stuff. Those are great times that looking back on that, how do you luck into something like that?
Oh, yeah. That wouldn't happen anywhere else, only in Alaska.
Yeah.
So you were at that law firm, you met and dated and then married a journalist. Did you start doing First Amendment journalism type law work right away?
Yeah, I did. It was actually before I was admitted to the bar. There was an issue. So I was in their office, Bob Wagstaff and his partner, Colin and Middleton. I had space there, but I was not part of the law firm. Bob, for people who don't know him, was a lawyer. He won a couple cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. He was very well known and excellent lawyer. So there was a reporter named Bob Porterfield. He and Howard Weaver were the main people who were responsible for the Daily News's first Pulitzer, which I think was in 1976. And then also Jim Babb was part of that team. I think most of the reporting was done by Howard and Bob. Bob was interesting because he had been an ex-cop, I think, and had not graduated from college and probably felt that sometimes hanging out with all these great, aggressive, diligent reporter. But he got a chance to go to Harvard on a Nieman Fellowship. And for somebody, I think maybe who hadn't gone as far in school otherwise as he wanted to or things, or just felt this is a great opportunity. So he did that. But he got subpoenaed in a case out of Fairbanks, a criminal case, while he happened to be in Harvard at the time in this program for journalists. And so I represented him. There was a lawyer that the Daily News had, but basically asked if I would do it. And that was something I was interested in, something I knew something about. And it was really a unique opportunity because in order to get affidavits and things saying how having reporters' privilege and protecting the right of reporters not to be compelled to testify was something that was important, but also was the first time this had come up basically in Alaska. But Bob is back at Harvard with prominent journalists from around the country. So we were able to get affidavits from not only some local people, but people who are pros known in the journalism community. And anyway, so I got sworn in. Colin called Justice Matthews and asked if I could get sworn in early so I could appear in court to do that case. And I did. And that was my first. And then also, I guess with the advocate, I was right off the bat when I first came here. They could afford me because I was getting the same thing that they were all getting, which was nothing. And I'd review stories because they were very aggressive, did a lot of great journalism in those days. And they folded basically when Kay Fanning sold the Daily News to McClatchy, which really is probably one of the best things that happened in Alaska journalism, at least at that time. And I think everybody saw the writing on the wall. I was on the board at that time with the advocate. I remember we had a board meeting and they decided to fold it, Howard and Pat. That was quite a team, the others. And so they folded it and went to work with the new owners of the Daily News. Like Stan Abbott was still the executive editor then, but Howard became editor, of course. And I think he's probably the most significant figure to my mind, in Alaska journalism. It's sad that you could walk into a crowded room, probably even at a journalism conference, and people wouldn't know today necessarily who is Howard Weaver. Howard doesn't have his name on the building, but just in terms of journalism itself, Howard is really significant, both in he was a good writer. They won the World Pulitzer Prize.
They did. They won. So the second Pulitzer Prize, your wife, Suzan, was part of.
She was part of that team. When we say Pulitzer Prize, there's a number of Pulitzer Prizes, but there's one award they give every year called the Gold Medal for Public Service. And that goes to the organization as opposed to a news organization as opposed to a specific reporter. But in the case of the first one, Howard and Bob had clearly done all the work, and Jim Babb on that team too. And it was a small thing to begin with. In those days, Kay Fanning, who left to be the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, asked them at around that time, should I have a Christmas party or I could get a microwave? And they said, we'll throw the Christmas party. You get a microwave. So that was the level of wealth at that time. The second Pulitzer, yeah, that was a tremendous.
And Susan's involvement.
Yeah, Suzan was involved because she was writing columns and was editorial page editor. And I actually have a Pulitzer medallion. In some ways, I was peripherally involved in that team, but it's really, we have that on the mantle because she was the member of that team. But when I say the significance of Howard Weaver, part of it is just his DNA, whether it's recognized or not, is throughout the journalism community in Alaska, including broadcast and every other context. But Dave Hewlin, I think, was a key figure in that. Dave Hewlin, I can't imagine that he gets enough credit for what he has done over the time here.
37 years.
37 years, and really going with the Daily News and then with the Dispatch and back with the Daily News. And I think part of the reason for that is he was somebody that everybody knew. We talk about a culture clash when Alice Rogoff and Tony Hoffinger bought the Daily News from McClatchy. Dave Hewlin was a great choice to be able to manage bringing those cultures together.
And when the Binkley family bought the Daily News, they kept David Hewlin as editor.
Exactly.
To keep the continuity. And it was the good choice because that's when the ADN won their third Pulitzer Prize.
It's also good to note that when the Daily News won the third Pulitzer for Lawless series, that was not under the heavily financed McClatchy, and it's more like in the early days, but it shows that I think in part that DNA that was built over the years is still there. In other words, This is a big deal.
It's a big deal.
It shows the caliber of journalism that we have here that's built on something and working with editors who have worked with editors who have built something important in journalism. And we still have it. And so when people say, oh, we don't have newspapers anymore, I was just listening to somebody say, oh, I don't listen to anything here, like we can't trust the local media, they're not edited or whatever. They do. They still are in there doing their work. Vicki Ho has taken over from David Hewlin, a great choice. She's not as visible as some of the people who have been around for as long. Lori Townsend and Annie Fight and all the people over public media and folks at Channel 2 and other places. And a number of the bloggers who grew up and trained as journalists or carrying on their work in their own way. So we still have it. The second Pulitzer, I think, is called The People in Peril, built on some earlier reporting, but you can still find copies of all the articles that they wrote. And it was really a brilliant, concerted effort from the top down in terms of figuring out what to do. And all the reporters, I couldn't begin to name them all and do justice. Tom Kazai had done a lot of work in rural Alaska. His book, The Wake of the Unseen Object, is something that is just a classic.
Which is also a product
Sheila
of
Toomey.
the fact that there was so much money that they could afford to send a journalist into the bush with the instructions of, if there's a news story, don't do that.
Yeah, famous
yeah.
instructions.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were lucky. It was exciting a time to be involved in journalism as anywhere in the country, bar none. We had money coming in because McClatchy was
Competing with the Times.
If people don't remember, there was the Anchorage Times was the dominant newspaper, had been. Its publisher, Bob Atwood, was just a pillar of Anchorage society and a champion campaign for statehood. And so to turn the tide on that, they brought in a guy named Jerry Grilly as a publisher. And he later went on to also win the newspaper war in another couple communities, including Colorado, where I think he is now. It was a tremendous time to be a journalist. It was exciting. They had the money to do things and hired great people, a number of whom are still around, or they have taught the people who are still around. It's hard because to compare what we have now and what we had then, both in terms of, like you say, the money for the organization. I think McClatchy was one of the largest newspaper organizations in the country, and I think certainly one of the best because they were controlled by a family that had been journalists running newspapers for 100 years or something and cared about journalism. And so the values were there and they were willing to put the money into it. Kay Fanning had a chance to sell to Al Newharth from USA Today, and she didn't want it to become one of those papers, to her credit. I represented the Daily News since 1978. I also represented the Dispatch and Tony and Amanda when they started that. And Alice Rogoff was behind that. I've probably done work with most news organizations in the state.
I said that out of the 16 in my media series that you've represented 13 of them.
Probably in one way or another on news issues. Mm-hmm. And so with the Daily News, I'd done sort of everything. But what I was going to say is that Alice was a whole different thing because I think people unfairly attributed to her husband's wealth, which was not accurate. She was her own person and she had her own ability to finance some things, but not unlimited wealth that would be attributed to her, I think, ex-husband. But she also poured money in beyond what was sustainable if you were using a traditional model of, what you can raise through advertising and subscriptions you can spend to hire reporters and do things. And McClatchy was willing to invest money to win a newspaper war. And then once they won, they somewhat gradually, obviously tapered
regained
off.
some of their profit, or regained some of their losses.
Yeah, and it's natural, it's understandable, but you can't sustain that forever.
Pat Doherty said that the McClatchys lost $100 million in that newspaper war. Ryan Binkley says that number's inflated, that it's not that much. And Ryan Binkley makes a big point in his interview of saying that the reason why people go into the newspaper business is because it is profitable. And even today, that the ADN is making a profit, and that's why the Binkleys own the paper.
Yeah, I have to say, what they told people when they bought it was, because obviously their family's been around for a long time, involved in politics, and that made some people wonder, is there an agenda there or something? And I think Ryan Binkley came in and from the beginning basically said, my family's been here for a long time. We're going to be here for a long time. We care about the state. They hadn't done newspapers before, but quick study, smart people. And I think it's worked well. I think having a local family own this, especially if they're willing to say, yeah, we want to learn about this business like we've learned about other businesses and make it work. And I think the results have been good. We're not owned by one of these hedge fund companies or one of these companies like Black or Carpenter or one of the ones that
bought up the smaller newspapers in Alaska.
Yeah,
and
it could easily have been one of those things. And yes, is it the glory days of that we were just talking about with all this money? No, there's no reason to think it would be. And in fact, that's endemic in the newspaper world altogether, of course. But what I was going to say is Alice put in money beyond what
a reasonable person would do.
What could be, and it was great. She was willing to do it. And as long as it lasted, it was good. We probably would not have gone after there was a case that we did, a public records case back in 2010 when they owned it, that probably may have made the difference in the U.S. Senate race, because we covered some records that reflected poorly on the candidate who had been selected in the primary, Joe Miller and Lisa Murkowski. That was hotly contested, and I think had it not been for Alice being here, for example, that probably wouldn't have happened. The Joe Miller case is probably one of the most interesting, and it was just interesting litigation.
Okay, what happened?
Joe Miller was a candidate. He still lives in Fairbanks, I think, and he was a candidate that any Republican Party chair would drool over when he came in with the credentials he had, and Bronze Star and big family and a very good lawyer for the borough and so on. And he was a Tea Party candidate, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't remember how formal the affiliation was, but it was pretty much aligned. And that was the day, this was in the days that Sarah Palin had been.
This was 2010.
This was 2010, right.
And he primaried Lisa Murkowski.
So he primaried Lisa Murkowski. It was right after Ted Stevens died, the primary was, I think. And I think Lisa, my recollection is that she had ads in the can from Senator Stevens that she chose not to use because he had just died, and out of respect for that. And the Tea Party was pretty strong then. And I think Senator Murkowski is somebody who always has to walk a line. She's a senator for the whole state, and the whole state is divided now, and it was somewhat divided then, right? So the Tea Party was flanking from the right. And anyway, so Joe Miller, we heard a rumor that there was something, we didn't know what, but something that was worth investigating, and we were trying to figure out what it was. And we ended up filing a public records suit with the Fairbanks Borough. And the short of it is Joe Miller was represented by Sarah Palin's lawyers, good lawyers, and the borough had their own lawyer. And we ended up finding that getting access to the records about a month and a half before the election, which showed that he'd snuck onto his coworkers' computers while they were out to lunch. He was part-time, so he didn't take the same lunch hour that they did, and he wanted to help rig a political poll that he himself was doing to influence something at the upcoming Republican meeting and make it look like there was more responses coming from different people. And so he went on several of his coworkers' computers, and then when they came back, they said they couldn't find something they'd been working on, and he had accidentally wiped out the caches on their computers. And has somebody been on my computer? No, I don't know anything about that. And then,
so he had basically rigged a poll, but was it directly about him?
But I believe that what it was is that the state party chair, Randy Riedrich, there were some differences of opinion. I think he was trying to mobilize some support for a position that he had that was maybe challenging. He argued there's some concerns about his personal safety and things like that. And so anyway, he was trying to do a poll that supported his position. And so he wanted to look like there were more responses coming, and then tried to cover that up and lied about it. And so that's big news before the election. So that was it.
So who were you representing?
That was the Alaska Dispatch.
Okay, you were representing the Alaska Dispatch. And forgive me, I have no idea who sued whom.
The Alaska Dispatch sued the Fairbanks Borough because they were his employer.
Uh-huh.
So basically, and they said, these are employment records and we can't give them out. And we had argued over those legal things.
But why were they suing the borough?
Because so what we were trying to get was public records of the borough about his employment.
Got it.
That related.
Got it. So you basically, they were trying to do reporting on Joe Miller as a candidate.
Exactly.
And they couldn't get access to the records that they should have had access to.
And this was at the tail end of a pretty lengthy and heated campaign. During that same campaign, Tony Huffinger had been arrested by Joe Miller's security people at Central High School. And we ended up having our pictures in the New York Times because of this arrest of the journalist. So it was a heated campaign to begin with, and not just between the candidates, but also there was some intense interest by the journalists covering it.
That's so interesting, because I think that I've often thought that the type of law that you would be doing would be representing journalists who are being sued for some reason, for defamation and that type of thing, like being sued because of their reporting, saying that it was defamatory. But in this case, you were suing on behalf of the media organization to have access.
Yes. Yeah. And that's right. And over the years have represented a number of news media in, say, libel cases or invasion of privacy cases. Have some going now. Have had over the years for various places around the state. Well, a lot of what the journalists are interested in most is how do we get access to what we need for our reporting? And so some of those Supreme Court cases I mentioned, Alaska Supreme Court, were cases where we said where the city, for example, tries to not tell the public how much they settle a lawsuit for.
This happened a lot when Bronson was mayor. There were many requests for information that were submitted to the municipality. I know because I was a party to people who were asking for this information. And one thing that would happen is that they would say that it was going to take 24 hours of time, that you were going to have to pay $100 an hour or something like for the work. Like they would send like some bill. Do you want to proceed with this records request? And it seemed like that was a way of trying to dissuade you from continuing.
Yeah, there's a couple things that raises. One is that there's a law, and then there's how people implement the law. And I think, frankly, some of the most important people in the state in terms of the public and journalists having access to public meetings and public records are the lawyers who represent municipalities and school boards and public agencies and have to advise their clients. And if they're doing their job well and they're looking out for the public interest, which I consider to be part of their job, and I think a lot of them do too, over the years, they're really important in terms of keeping things open. And I will say one thing that's really unfortunate. So in 1990, I think, I worked with Kay Brown, who was a former legislator, and of course later did a lot of other things. But Kay was in the legislature then, and we worked on a rewrite of the public records law for several things. She had a specific reason for doing this, but she was also a former journalist and was sympathetic to understanding a lot of the issues that we were looking at. She had been married to Pat Doherty back at that time. And so everybody who was in that community, we knew that there were some things that needed to be changed, and we worked with the legislature that year to do that. And 3 years later, we also did some revisions to the Open Meetings Act, which I worked on in 1993. Probably the worst thing in my time here that's happened, at least affecting this arena, is Alaska is the only state, I think, that follows what they call the English rule, the English rule, in terms of awarding attorney's fees. So in any given civil case, the presumption is that the side that wins can get part of their attorney's fees back from the other side. And there was an exception to that if it was a public interest case, and this was kind of grafted on over the years by the courts, but if it was a public interest case, that two things. One is if you lost, you didn't have to pay the other side. And if you won, instead of getting just a portion of your fees, you could get all of your fees. The short of it is that the legislature got rid of that public interest exception. And I think it's just been a horrible thing. So,
why did they do that?
Supposedly, what you heard most often was it was to prevent frivolous environmental suits. And so one thing, by definition, if it was frivolous, they wouldn't have lost the case. And there's already law that said if it's a frivolous case, you could get. So, I mean, that's a silly thing. But it's certainly a deterrent against suing. And I think what they want to do is discourage people from bringing suits.
Even worthwhile ones, because there's a potential huge bill at the end.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah. Vic Fisher and Bella Hammond and others had filed a suit. I'm not going to remember exactly which issue, because Vic in particular is very active in championing causes throughout his life. And I'm trying to remember this specific one, but I think it had to do with Pebble. Could be wrong. And they lost that, and they were on the hook until it went to the Supreme Court. They were on the hook for a huge amount of money. But what I was going to say is that this is the only place in the country where a citizen has to pay the government if they are denied access to public records or public meetings, and then they have to try and do something. If they take it to court, they lose, they have to pay the government. It's the only place in the country, and it's a horrible thing. It's something that somebody
needs to be fixed. Yeah, no, that's really good to know. So you were responsible for why everyone gets the PFD.
My little contribution to this was that I came up with the idea that it was unconstitutional to exclude children because there was a big issue.
Tell us that when they're debating like having the PFD, it was only going to be for adults. And your amount was going to be based on the amount of time you've been in Alaska.
Yeah, what they finally kind of settled on, it was going to be $50, I think, for every year you had been in Alaska, if I'm remembering right. And there's a lawyer named Ron Zobel who brought the lawsuit, Ron and Penny, his wife, and it caused a huge controversy. People were getting death threats. And it was how long you had been here. And he was saying, we have a right to travel around the country and live where you want to, and to discriminate against people because they haven't been here as long as other people is wrong. Went to the U.S. Supreme Court, they won. While it was in progress, the legislature had hired the guy I was working with, Bob Wagstaff, and his partner, Colin and Middleton, and looking at what should the result be, and if it doesn't come out the way we think, what's it going to be? And actually, they came up with a decision and said they're right, they're going to win, they should win, and they canceled the contract and never went further. But in the course of working on that with him, it occurred to me that was really wrong to have a kid who'd grown up here and lived here for 18 years. He gets $0. Somebody who's been here for a year or two gets $50, gets something, right? And just discriminating on the basis of age was wrong. And so I did a memo on it, and it went, I don't know if it went nowhere, but it sat there. And then as we were getting close to the end of the legislative session, if I'm recalling correctly, I think Terry Gardner was the Speaker of the House there. There's a kind of traditional end of the season, who's going to adjourn out from under the other one and whose agenda is getting advanced. And I think there was an issue where the Senate was adjourning and the House said no. I think the leadership was talking to each other and they said, we have an opinion that says this is unconstitutional if we do this. And I think somehow out of that, it got changed. The little story behind that is I best remember it now.
You were tangentially involved with the Sheffield impeachment?
I, at the time, represented a number of news organizations, including
It was like 1985, somewhere around there.
Governor Bill Sheffield was being investigated. The claim was that he was steered an office lease in Fairbanks to a friend or a business associate. And some things came out of that later that when we were rewriting the public records law to deal with some of the issues that came up in that too, but that's a different story. So I think at the time I was mainly representing the Daily News, but also had done work for the Associated Press and the Newsminer. And I had an old college friend's parents who came into town and seen for years and barely knew them, but here they were in Alaska and they said, we're here. And I said, oh, come over for dinner. And so they came over for dinner and we had no sooner, we're 5 minutes into the salmon's off the grill and we're sitting down to dinner and I get a call and I answered it and the guy said, I have to talk to you about this. Can you call back later? He said, it's pressing. I said, can you give me 30 minutes? He said, yeah. Sat back down to dinner, another call 5 minutes later. And then again, 10 minutes later from the Associated Press and the Daily News and the Newsminer. And the gist of it was that these reporters had been covering this grand jury proceeding. They didn't know where it was. It's a Friday late afternoon. They came back in to see what had happened. They couldn't find anybody around, no guards. So they walked back to the grand jury room, nobody there. On their way out, they're talking to themselves and they were walking past a trash can. They say, one of them jokes, oh, that must be the grand jury's trash. And I don't know who blinked first, if they all thought maybe I'll circle back and see if it really is or whatever happened. They did actually look into it once that had been said out loud, and they found carbon paper. In those days, you had triplicate forms with a couple different colors of carbon paper for filing and for the original and so on, with carbon paper in between them. And so those carbon papers had been thrown in the trash can when the other things had been filed. So they went through them, and by holding them up, turning it every which way, shining a light through them, look in the mirror, you could start reading it. And it turns out that I think everybody might have been embarrassed to do a story based on something found in the trash. And I don't think they normally would have done that kind of thing to begin with, but it turned out to be a pretty newsworthy thing because the grand jury was asking a question of whether they could, instead of indicting the governor, could they recommend impeachment? So it was a big news story.
And they ultimately recommended impeachment. So the grand jury recommended impeachment as opposed to indictment? Or
I believe that must be because that was the question they had. And I don't believe he was ever indicted. He was impeached and the Senate had a trial. And he had a Senate, he was acquitted at the trial in the Senate.
What happens if the governor is indicted? Do you know?
I guess it depends on who the governor is, what the charges are and everything. First thing that comes to mind, and it's probably not what you're asking, but I remember Rod Blagojevich being indicted, and he got
in Illinois,
and he was, I think, sent to prison and pardoned by President Trump. So maybe
the question was, could you be indicted and not be impeached? I think recommended impeachment instead of indictment.
Oh yeah, I think those are two different things. The impeachment is really a political process. The indictment is a criminal.
But so you could have been indicted and impeached.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Got it.
And I suspect it's probably more likely that somebody would be, if they were indicted,
they would be impeached.
Might be.
Because we wouldn't want a felon to be serving in elected office.
No, I wouldn't think so.
In the Trump administration, with basically not respecting the rule of law, not respecting lawyers, I feel like that it would embolden folks not to comply with records requests. Because,
you know
what I mean? Like you'll just wait it out.
Yeah, it's been a continuing problem with the Federal Freedom of Information Act on many levels. And to some extent, the state courts will say, we'll track this because the laws are so similar, we'll apply the same law. Again, I think it is a problem. And I think that we have to rely on judges, if it gets to them, to enforce the law. Also to, like I say, attorneys advising municipal agencies, school boards around the state, because there are provisions in the law that we passed in 1990 that specifically say how much you can charge. And I know a lot of them are not doing that. And that's like the first 5 hours in any calendar month for any requester is free. They can only charge for the amounts after that. And I know that law is being violated, and different things that make it harder or make these huge estimates. And then, so that's something that needs to be constantly addressed and monitored. And the other thing is that for journalists, they just need to also be cognizant of not saying, as most of them know, not to say, I need all the records that relate to this. You don't have to say why you want public records. But sometimes if you go in and say to the clerk, here's what I'm looking at, they may be able to say, oh, we can help you with that. You don't need these 2 file cabinets of stuff. You need this summary report that we did and then some backup, and we can point you in the right direction. So those things are helpful, but not if you've got a government that says you can't come in our building if you don't adhere to our way of thinking. We're taking away, obviously we don't have a Pentagon here, but taking away press passes for people who won't agree, new laws that say, the new security resolution they're talking about, going after nonprofits that, so are basically un-American, anti-Christian, don't toe the line. And this sounds like hypothetical fear-mongering or something. You can go look at it. You can see what it says, and it says these things that are very recent from last month, I think.
And it's specifically saying that we're going to go after anti-fascist people who are doing things under the anti-fascist label.
Like my Uncle Bud, who's got a silver star in
yeah,
World
no,
War
it's
II.
crazy.
He was an anti-fascist.
That we're gonna, yeah. But hey, I had Gabe Rotman on the podcast in July, and he's the VP of Policy at Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and it's funny because I felt like it was a big get to have him on and to talk about like the types of protections that they could offer to journalists. And we talked specifically about journalists who might not be Americans, like foreign journalists working in America who could basically be deported for their reporting. So what I was going to ask you is if you could give any specific advice to any journalists working in Alaska today of things that they might need to know, because it seems like that we are increasingly becoming a more hostile environment and a more dangerous environment for reporters to be reporting on people in power.
Yeah, that's certainly true at the national level. The Reporters Committee is a great organization, and they're very helpful, and they got some great expertise, and they're involved in many things, amicus briefs and things at the national level, and just a great network of support. What that really translates into when he says, oh yeah, somebody has a problem, we provide support. What they do to provide support is they'll call me.
Yeah, because you wrote the book for journalists. Like you wrote the guide to freedom of the press in Alaska.
The Reporters Committee has a survey of all 50 states and the law in that area. And it used to be called tapping official secrets, but it's called, I think, open government or something. And it's a good thing to know about it. It's because it's free. I've been doing it since they started. And I think Columbia Journalism Review had something when they came out with their last edition, and they called me because I had been doing this longer than anybody in the country. So it's grown to be large. But the nice thing about it, if you're interested in public records, public meeting stuff, you shouldn't have to call a lawyer for all these things.
You could look it up.
You can look it up, and it's word searchers, rcfp.org, I think.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes to your specific document about the law
for Alaska. Yeah, it's a good resource. It's set up in a structure that they have. The fact that it's word searchable is really useful.
Speaking of money, you made a reference earlier implying some pro bono work. I also know my staff did a little research on you before we started about how you've said that your prices are very reasonable and always have been. And to me, that makes me think that you have a love for this work and a willingness to do this work, even if it may not be the most profitable work.
Yeah, I sometimes joke with my friends I've carved out the most interesting, non-lucrative corner of the legal market. And part of that is because, of course, there's going to be some things that have to be done because you get sued. But for a lot of the work that's more discretionary, that you can't just go after every record that you don't get or open meetings. In those early days, we went to the Alaska Supreme Court several times on establishing some good law on open meetings and public records, access to confidential settlements, and a variety of other things. And people knew that we were serious about it. So it's good to be able to do those things. But yeah, I do have a love for it. It's something I care about a lot. It's great to see some things continue and get stronger.
You made enough to support your family. And it was at a time when journalists were being paid fairly well with McClatchy owning it. So I guess you and Suzan did okay.
We weren't always both working at the same time, but I could have done other things that would have been
more lucrative.
Yeah.
And you had 2 kids.
Yeah.
2 boys.
Martin and Cameron, they were, I think, Martin was just about to turn 9 and Cameron was 6 when Suzan died.
Yeah. And I read her obituary and the news reporting at the time, and it said that she was getting a blood test and died. It was a little bit confusing.
Yeah. We had actually gone to Mayo in Minnesota. We were trying to get a second opinion. So she had another thing that people don't die of anymore. It's not a death sentence, I would say. People do die of it, multiple myeloma. And so we were gone. We thought for the weekend.
You left the boys here in Anchorage?
Yeah, they were with my sister Ann and their husband George Bryson, who was also a journalist. And the test that we would go into regularly with our oncologist here in town, they do a bone marrow draw, which is a very medieval procedure where they screw into your closest bone and take bone marrow out. But they give it a local anesthesia. And at Mayo, they routinely gave a general anesthesia, and she never came out of it. So that was a surprise to all of us.
So you were just thinking that you were going to get a second opinion.
Yeah.
You'd be home after the end of the weekend. I can't even imagine. Did they just come out and say, hey, she passed away?
Well, actually, I knew she was going to be under sedation from that for a while. So I went out birthday shopping for Martin because his birthday was a few days later, and came back, and there's all kinds of activity in the room. And so I just parked myself in the back of the room, and then it was over. But yeah.
And then you're a single parent.
Yeah.
Like instantly.
Right. Yeah, I was a single parent while the kids were in grade school and middle school, high school. I have to say, people manage those things in different ways. I was extraordinarily lucky. It was a great community here in Anchorage, but particularly I had 2 sisters that lived here at the time, my sister Ann and her husband George, and they had 3 kids about the same age as our kids, and then my sister Beth, and both of them were involved in education here for many years. Spectacular people. There's that cliche about it takes a village. It does, and whatever I fumbled through myself, it was mainly because I had great support.
Charles Wolford wrote a remembrance of Suzan not that long ago, 6 or 7 years ago, talking about how she was who he wanted to be as a journalist, and talking about the dedication of the park in Government Hill.
Yeah, she was quite a beloved and respected figure in the community, and sometime I'll tell you a story of a proposal. I hijacked her column to propose to her. And
tell it now.
Shouldn't have said that, right? She had column people say, I read you every day. Actually, her column was in the paper 3 days a week, I think. But Howard, who was her boss and my best friend, I say Howard is my best friend. I think that's true. I would hasten to add that I think there are other people who would also consider him his best friend, and I think we're probably his best friend, Pat Doherty, Craig Goodrich, and others. But anyway, we were very close, and we lived across the street from each other, and a lot of times we had strategized about lawsuits that were going to happen or stories that we're working on sitting on the curb between our houses or something, and we were real close. So when I told Howard I was going to ask Suzan to marry me, I wrote a column, and then I asked her to substitute it in the paper for her column, and took her out to dinner. And I guess this is, I don't know what your podcast is rated, but anyway,
it's rated X.
Okay. We went to Josephine's at the Sheraton for dinner, and then I got in a room and we stayed overnight there. So in the morning, she's got to get to work, and we both do. And in those days, they had put newspapers under the door. I don't know if they still do that or not. And so the newspaper comes under the door, and I'm just trying to not say too much about it. Say, yeah, want to take a look at the paper? I said, why would I want to do that? Just check to make sure your column got in okay. So I've read it. I don't care. So I finally got her to subtly or less subtly take a look at it. And in those days, and I think maybe still, when somebody would leave the paper, that sometimes they do a fake one-off edition with nice things for their colleagues saying about them, and it's a fake souvenir edition. So she assumed that's what it was.
So she assumed this hadn't gone out to the entire
right. And then she got it. She called the newsroom secretary to say, I'm going to be in a little bit late. And she said, what did you say? People are calling in from all over. That's what you said. So. Anyway.
Oh, but so I guess we could make it clear. So you would propose to her in the column, but you'd actually already proposed to her in real life. No. So the column was the proposal.
No. Okay. That's, no, not quite that bad. I proposed to her at dinner.
Got it.
But I had already arranged with Howard to run the column.
Got it.
And so when she woke up to the
she had already said,
oh
yes, my God, but what if she said no?
Yeah, that was, yeah.
That would have been a major bummer.
That would, yeah.
So she said yes. And so when she called in to say she was going to be a few minutes late, they asked her what she said, and she said yes.
Oh, yeah. She said they're getting calls from all over North Slope.
Did you guys have a big wedding?
That's funny. We did.
I just feel like it would be like Alaska journalism royalty.
It was our family and stuff. We have a big family. We had friends. A lot of them were journalists, but it was our friends and family. It was a church wedding. She thought I was Catholic, so she took instructions without me knowing it to just become Catholic. But
oh my God! So she became a Catholic for you?
I think so. Yeah.
Oh,
or at least she did. I think she took all the classes, and I think
And you got married in a Catholic church.
Yeah,
in Anchorage?
Holy Family and Archbishop Hurley. We knew him from things she had written, and he was a pretty interesting guy and somebody we knew. Anyway, so yeah, he was that, and Howard and Barb were in the wedding, and John Larson, news director at Channel 2, and Miriam, and so it was a mix of family, and her 101-year-old grandmother was there.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Tell us about the gnome nugget and the aliens.
So there's a woman named Nancy McGuire who I think maybe took over from Elbro Gregory, this longtime publisher. And Nancy McGuire was the publisher of the Gnome Nugget for years, a wonderful woman, a journalist, and she's passed it on to a great editor there now too. But Nancy, while she was alive, called me one time and tried to get me interested. It took me a while to get interested. She said, they're making a movie and it's about aliens and they're using my byline and stuff like that. She was very persistent about it. And she said, I'm from Mars. She's from Mars, Pennsylvania. But she said, we don't have aliens here. We never did. And what was offensive to her was that they were using her byline and the byline of somebody else on her staff to make it seem like they had written articles that were just
NBC.
There was a company that was promoting a movie called The Fourth Kind, I think. I haven't thought about this for a bit, but it was starred Mila Jovovich as an actor, and there's a woman named Abigail Tyler, Dr. Abigail Tyler, and she'd moved to Nome, and she had a little inset picture of her saying, I'm not a real doctor, but I portray Dr. Abigail Tyler.
Oh, Dr. Abigail Tyler was a real person.
And it turns out there had been, that's what appeared to be, right? And apparently there had been a number of missing, mostly indigenous people in Nome who had gone missing, and things happen in harsh climates, winter, rivers, just drownings and all kinds of things. But apparently what everybody had overlooked, the movie was revealing, it was that this alien abductions.
Got it.
So Abigail Tyler supposedly was this doctor who had moved there, and in the midst of her therapy sessions, this all comes out, right? So you see
the actress was saying, here's the real person and that I'm portraying. So they're trying to make it a real story happening in Nome.
Right.
That the reason why we had so many murdered and missing indigenous people was because they were being abducted.
And this
by
is
aliens.
a feature
film. But these websites weren't showing it as part of the movie.
No. So what was happening is if you saw this ad, hi, I'm Mila Jovovich, and this is I portray a real doctor. You think, that seems a little fishy. Alien abductions. Right. Because see anything about alien abduction, where would you find out if it's true? You go on the internet.
So when you go on the internet,
you go on the internet, you would find an actual story.
News
from the Gnome Nugget. Oh, Dr. Abigail Tyler has moved here and she set up a practice. Just a minor thing. You look at another thing. Oh, her husband died, and there's obituaries in the Fairbanks News Miner. And you see these on websites that are aggregating news stories that look just like, got stories from the Daily News and the Cordova Times and Juneau Empire. And some of them are real stories, have nothing to do with it.
They put a ton of work into it.
Yeah, it was a big Hollywood production. And so I get it because, basically people don't know when they go online whether these news stories are real or not, whether these news aggregating sites are real or not. They seem to be. They had real stories mixed in with fake ones. They had fake stories written with real people's bylines. So the short of it is we took it up with NBC Universal. They were distributing the film.
Did you sue on behalf of the folks whose real bylines were being used without the permission?
We actually never sued it. What I did is I made a call to NBC Universal. I talked to their vice president in charge of all these things, and they were responsive, I will say. But before I did screen captures of everything that we had, all the news sites, all the news stories that popped up when you did it, so I'd be able to prove it. And it was a good thing I did because within probably a half an hour after I had my first call with the vice president of NBC Universal, they were all gone. And they were responsive. They got the issue. They went to the company that was doing it, and it was on the verge of coming out, and they shut it down.
And you've got money. You got damages.
We got some, basically, in addition to stopping this, we put a new roof on the Gnome Nugget. And I think one of the things that we said was that the real harm was to public trust and confidence in journalism. So how do you address this?
Early 2000s.
Seems like it was 25 years ago, maybe. So we said, how do you address this? Is not specifically a thing where this particular newspaper, this particular reporter was harmed.
It was
the harm to the public trust and confidence in journalism. So actually, it got something together where everybody agreed that they put some money aside for the Alaska Press Club, which really does a lot of great work, bringing together journalists and helping to educate and improve journalism overall. So there's that. I think we got a little bit of money for some scholarships for native journalists. And also I said, look, we have a deal. You don't need to do this because we already agreed on these things. The original story, the whole notion of this movie, and it was a Hollywood movie, if it weren't for these other things about the fake news sites, I said, the premise of this story is that there are people in this community and known, that those are real people. And when you do stories about people who were missing and, the explanation is alien abductions, whatever the explanation was, those are real people whose families, somebody died in the cold. Somebody died in the cold, somebody fell in the river, somebody,
was murdered.
The people were gone, and those are real families. And so you're treating this as a Hollywood movie. I said, they were trying to raise money for a shelter at the time too, for cold weather. And so I said, you don't have to do this, but it'd be a class thing if you maybe gave some money to them too. And they said they would. So anyway, it was an interesting thing where we were able to bring the whole community together that was affected by this and get some positive results.
So you've been the preeminent media lawyer in the state of Alaska since the late 70s.
Yeah,
so you've been
78 was my first.
And your wife Suzan was a journalist. You were intricately embedded with media when it was at its biggest. And there's been a steady paring down over the decades to a much smaller media landscape in 2025.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have just as much work? Do you have more work?
Oh, geez, no.
No, less work?
Oh, yeah, of course. It's a combination of things, but part of it is there's less what I would call discretionary spending. Like we're talking about.
All these media organizations have less money to pay for a lawyer.
Yeah, we go to the Supreme Court to say that, to find out that there's an $11 million settlement with an asbestos company that they're fighting tooth and nail to keep secret. And we're saying, no, public money, the way it's spent, how it's spent should be public. Or the access to records of municipal employees, how much they get paid, or any variety of things. Those are harder to just do. There's always something going. If you get sued for libel, you have to respond to it. But so making those choices, like Alice did, to go after the records because they were so important. There was such an important race, and somebody who's going for one of the highest offices in the state.
In the country.
In the country, right. To go after that. So, yeah, it was a combination of being willing to go after some of those things, but also having, for a time, having somebody who's able to support that. So the Daily News was able to do that. And you build up some experience, some expertise, so that you can then basically, you can give that to other people for free because you collected it.
Right. Well, I think that my mistake is that I assumed that in 2025, in the second Trump term, that there's 1,000,001 violations of folks' freedom of speech, in my opinion, and that there's tons of cases out there, and that even if we had less media figures in Alaska, we should have more cases because there's a lot more violations, is my feeling.
Yeah, keep in mind that most of these things that you're talking about with Trump administration, it was horrible, and we're talking about it daily and weekly when everybody's getting together and trying to figure out how do you cope with this. And are my kids going to see some of these things that are really constitutional violations? They're different than anything. I mean, they really are.
He's trying to remake the judiciary so that the judiciary rules in his favor.
The judiciary, the executive branch.
Congress doesn't meet anymore.
So basically he's reshaping the government, I think. And so you can argue about whether it's useful to study Germany in the late 30s. You can say the pendulum swings back and forth. I worry that when this pendulum swings, the people who are younger now or are starting to pay attention now, if this is the new normal, there are people who grow up here knowing that when you walk into a courthouse, you go through security, and then you go to a law library, you have to go through a metal detector, and that's long after. Same thing for airplanes. That didn't used to be the case, but that's what we know. When we say maybe
what's going to be the new normal?
What's the new normal that people accept is
post-Trump? Yeah, I had Margaret Stock on last week, immigration lawyer, and I said that I had gotten some criticism for this new series that I'm doing on folks who've decided to leave the country, and she says that there are some folks who've studied history And they may decide to leave early because they know it's going to get much worse. And we may look back and say they were the smart ones.
Yeah, I don't want to be those people. I don't want to be the ones that are jumping ship. I care about this country. And I think part of it's just not buying into the rhetoric. When you go out, that demonstration that they had last week, it was just really amazing to see the barrage in the days before that, where the unified approach by Trump and the members of Congress saying the people that are going to be out there on Saturday are basically un-American. They literally are saying they hate our country.
These people hate our country. This is a hate rally.
And these are people who are basically Hamas supporters and so on, which is the same language that they were using to deny the Columbia students. Certainly, if somebody's providing material support to terrorist organizations, I don't know nobody in the room is trying to say that's something that should be protected, but that's not what's happening. And by demonizing people who disagree with you, that's why we should care about free press and whatever form that takes. And having editorial pages that have letters to the editor from all sides and having a dialogue and putting it on ourselves to read more than what the people in our bubble put out.
The First Amendment, the freedom of the press, they don't need protection for writing journalism that everybody loves. It's reporting inconvenient facts. It's reporting things that make people uncomfortable or unhappy.
Yes, what's the Washington Post? Democracy dies in the dark. I feel like
they are dying in the dark.
Well, I was thinking on the way over here, I wonder if they're going to get crosswise with Tom Bodett and the copyright of his trademark thing. We'll leave the lights on for you, because I think they're turning off the lights.
They are. The Washington Post had such a crazy string of opinion pieces just a couple of days ago. It was like, with all of the insane things happening, they were just writing about very banal topics.
Yeah. I think the main thing is, think about what we're doing here. Obviously, we're all affected by it. We're part of our nation. And I always loved Bill Moyers, former PBS commentator, former presidential advisor. He had a great column, you can look it up, it's Why I Wear an American Flag Lapel Pin, basically. And the short of it is because he wasn't willing to cede that symbol of our country to the people who want to take, I don't want to say left wing, right wing, but basically he was talking about people who were saying it's un-American to have these views or to adopt these policies, and he's not willing to concede that to people who want to go around waving a flag and say, this is ours. No, they don't get to claim our flag. But we also need to make sure that what we think the flag stands for is something that we're fighting to keep going. And in terms of what's going on here, of course, there's ongoing fights. There always have been, all the things, but the municipal administration, there's a lot of bright spots where you say, look, just deal with what you've got in front of you and keep plugging away. Instead of saying, we don't like what the newspaper's doing, talk to them, see if you can get them to change, see if you can get them to take a different opinion, whether you're feeling like you're left out or maybe they haven't gone far enough or they've gone too far. But we got to support them. You can't say, oh, I don't like them, so I'm going to cut off my subscription, because that's one way things are going to die pretty quickly.
When you look at what's happening at the Pentagon, where all the press basically lost their press passes, except for the Lindell Pillow Company people, the people who were willing to sign this crazy document that the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, was requiring of all media.
Yeah.
I would say that Pete Hegseth is quite comfortable having the only reporters be folks from the Lindell Pillow Company.
The good news is that, first of all, the right of center, left of center news organizations, including Fox and maybe Newsmax, I think, but they all refused to sign it. And it was a pretty spontaneous thing. They basically, one guy started talking to another guy, and they all realized that they're walking out. One was doing it, another was doing it. They just all did it together. And it wasn't like the news organization said, you have to do this. They found that their news organizations were supporting them. And also, they're still doing the work as Pentagon reporters, which they have for years. Some of these guys have been working with each other, and they know each other's families for 30 or 40 years, and now all of a sudden they're out on the streets. But it's the public that's losing, because those stories that you could check on a source, or you could run something down, and a lot of times information is going both ways. The public is losing. These restrictions are unhealthy. But more than anything, I mean, you want to talk about un-American, saying that you have to go after news media or nonprofit organizations or something if they're not sufficiently if they're
not sufficiently anti-fascist. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and so where do you start? I think you One thing, keep it local and work on every level, but don't ignore there's this fire hose of problems to deal with, and having a healthy community and a way to stay sane in your community too. Just building that community, which the media are so much a part of. Yes.
The last question I ask is, do you have a book to recommend?
Actually, I should, because I told Christy, who was my fabulous partner for the last 13 years, I said, oh, Andrew's going to ask me about this. What I would say for this, just in terms of journalism, is a soundtrack of my life. It's Howard Weaver's book, Write Hard, Die Free, that Epicenter published. That's a nice window into journalism in that period that we're talking about by somebody.
I'm so glad you recommended that. I didn't know the book.
Oh, yeah.
I should read Howard Weaver's book.
You should.
Yeah. Well, John McKay, thank you so much. You are an American patriot. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.